I'm here with Professor Flint Leverett talking about the role of Iran as an actor in the Middle East and with relevance to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Professor Leverett, there's been a great deal of attention to the role of Iran in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere in the world as well. What are the most important elements or dimensions of that role that we should pay attention to?
I think what I would highlight is Iran's role, not just in connection with the Gaza war, but in Middle East regional security dynamics more generally. Iran's role as the center, the centering state, if you will, of this network of mostly non-state actors that have joined with Iran under a mantle of muqawama, resistance. And in the United States, this can get, I would say, caricatured as Iranian state support for terrorism. And unfortunately, I think that really blinds US policy to some of the most important things that are going on in terms of Iran's regional role. What this network is really is Iran working, developing relationships with with constituencies, unavoidable constituencies in countries in Iran's regional setting, unavoidable constituencies that are important but that have been marginalized in various ways and have real and legitimate grievances.
Mm-hmm.
And Iran, over years, over decades, builds partnerships with groups, movements that, in many important ways, authentically represent these constituencies. And Iran helps these groups and their constituencies organize to prosecute their grievances more effectively than they'd be able to do otherwise. And this obviously has a manifestation in terms of helping these groups develop increasingly potent, let's say, militia capabilities. But it also involves helping these groups emerge as political actors, including as parties that run for office. And over time, this has had some really appreciable benefits for Iran. I mean, it's a soft power asset, sure, but beyond that, it basically lets Iran promote greater political participation in situations where doing that helps to put its friends in positions of influence, positions of power. And in more states around Iran's regional neighborhood, Iran is able to put up basically a fire break to ensure that those states can't get easily co-opted as platforms for anti-Iranian action. And this is a really important part of Iran's regional security strategy. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, this is a movement that grows up resisting Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon in the 1980s. It's basically an Israeli objective to install a Maronite Christian dominated government that's going to make a separate peace with Israel and let Israel turn Lebanon into its own strategic platform. Iran makes these kinds of partnerships with groups representing disaffected. You have a Shia plurality in Lebanon, and Iran helps these groups, this Shia plurality, resist the occupation, resist Israeli invasion, and eventually force an Israeli withdrawal. And then Hezbollah becomes, in many ways, the most effective political party in Lebanese politics, with basically a de facto veto over any important move by a Lebanese government. That's strategically very valuable for Iran. In Iraq, where you have a Shia majority, this is why, after the United States invaded Iraq, overthrew Saddam, every government that's been elected in Iraq is a coalition of Shia Islamist parties and Kurdish nationalist parties, all of whom have very, very close relationships with Iran. After the terrors of the Iran-Iraq war, basically Iran, through this approach, has guaranteed that Iraq isn't in the future going to be a platform for that kind of anti-Iranian action. And in the Palestinian context, Iran's support for this Sunni movement, Hamas, plays a similar kind of role. And I think it's really important to understand Iran's regional role through that prism.
So it sounds as though this strategy of Iran for regional influence and security has been highly successful for them. What would you attribute that to? Is it, I mean, it sounds like it's not simply a matter of religious affinity. Is it resources? What else might
Part of it is there is the religious affinity. Certainly with Shia movements, there's that affinity. But even with Sunni groups like Hamas, there's a kind of pan-Islamic identity. Supporting resistance movements in these contexts is something that is popular. Public opinion polls would show across societies in the Middle East. This is why I say it's a soft power asset, among other things, for Iran. That's part of the effectiveness. On a per real or per dollar basis, I would argue Iran actually gets more bang out of a dollar spent helping Hezbollah, helping Hamas, than it does with some other things it might do with that dollar. This is actually pretty high payoff in the strategic terms for Iran for something that doesn't cost Iran all that much. And historically, if you look at it, Iran starts doing this after the Iran-Iraq war, when at a strategic level, Iran decided it had to reduce military spending. It needed to spend a lot on reconstruction, on various types of development initiatives in Iran, but it also had very pressing security needs, a region that didn't give it very much strategic depth. And so this, we call it the proxy strategy in the West. This approach let Iran address its regional security needs in some important ways, but it also did so in a pretty cost-efficient way.
So there is an ongoing, highly divisive political debate in the U.S. about the consequences of many aspects of the U.S. relationship with Iran, but in particular the Joint Plan of Action process, in which 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany negotiated an agreement that Iran agreed to restrain its enrichment of uranium, took effect in 2015. The U.S. ultimately withdrew in 2018 under the Trump administration. On the one hand, opponents of the nuclear deal with Iran in the U.S. and on the political right in Israel argue that this diplomatic process and the easing of sanctions ultimately empowered Iran, as they would describe it, a malevolent international actor, including support for Hamas. On the contrary, there are supporters of the Obama administration's diplomatic efforts that say, this was a significant diplomatic achievement, and abandoning the deal with Iran has actually heightened regional tensions and insecurity. So one side says the process itself endangered security. The other side says abandonment of it is what's endangered security. Which of these positions does the evidence support?
I think both of those positions have some problems with factual reality. I guess, relatively speaking, the harder line position has more problems than the less bellicose position, but neither side has that secure grounding in facts. For the more bellicose view, I would just point to a couple of facts that I think are important. Let's take Iran's support for Hamas. Iran started providing material support to Hamas back in the early 1990s. This is over a decade before the negotiations that would ultimately produce the JCPOA or any of this. There's no real correlation between Iran starting to support and building up its support for Hamas during this period and the JCPOA negotiations. Another kind of uncomfortable fact for the hardliners, during the period in which the United States was negotiating the JCPOA, was finalizing the JCPOA, and was implementing the JCPOA, so basically between 2013 and 2018, when, as you say, President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, during these years, the amount of material support provided by Iran for Hamas was zero. What happened in 2011, 2012, the head of Hamas's political bureau at the time, Khalid Mashal, took a decision to relocate the headquarters for Hamas's external political bureau from Damascus in Syria to Doha in Qatar. And that was basically done out of solidarity by Hamas with Sunni Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood that were supporting President Bashar al-Assad's overthrow in Syria. Iran didn't like that. Iran didn't approve of that. And for several years, Hamas got no support from Iran. And this is precisely during the period that the JCPOA is being negotiated and implemented. It wasn't yet.
Yeah, but if I could just, sorry to interrupt, but was the cutoff of Iranian support at all associated with the negotiation process, or simply
No.
independent of it?
It was independent of it. And okay, after Trump withdraws the United States from the JCPOA and started his maximum pressure campaign, which is supposed to, among other things, make it harder for Iran to support its regional partners. It's after that Iran resumes its material support for Hamas, because Hamas had a new political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, who's the political leader today, and Iran had, or Hamas in Iranian eyes, had made amends for some of what Iran saw as its previous mistakes. And at that point, Iran, when hardliners are saying our pressure is making it hard for Iran to do this, that's when Iran resumes its support for Hamas.
So in response to the U.S. decision in 2018, the maximum pressure campaign, Iran has in fact stepped up its movement toward enriching uranium. And,
Yes.
And my understanding is that, prior to that point, during the years of when the agreement was in place, that Iran was, according to all evidence, respecting its terms of the agreement. Let's say that the Biden administration has an interest, which it might, in returning to and restoring the deal. I mean, this may not be the opportune time, but at some future point, has what Iran has done in the interim, whether it's support for Hamas since 2018 and its advancement in the uranium enrichment process, has that made it more or less impossible for the Biden administration to roll back to that period and say, let's return to the negotiating table?
I think that's the way the question is framed. I mean, you can frame it that way, but what that framing obscures a bit, I think, is the particular limits on Iran's civil nuclear activities imposed by the JCPOA. They were never meant to be permanently imposed. From the time that the JCPOA went into effect, over a 10 to 15 year period from that time, if you had stayed in the deal, if you had played it out in terms of implementing it, 10 to 15 years after the entry into force, a lot of those limits, which Iran began to violate after Trump pulled the United States out of the deal, a lot of those limits would have expired anyway. And so this was never meant to be a kind of permanent way of hobbling Iran's nuclear development. There was always going to be a point where those limits eased. Iran could put in more advanced centrifuges. It could have more centrifuges operating than were allowed under the JCPOA, and so on. All things that Iran started to do a little bit early as a way of protesting the United States backing out of the deal. But things that, as I say, these were never meant to be permanent limits. If you played out JCPOA implementation, in fact, and I think this is one reason why the Biden administration was, in the end, whatever Biden had said during the campaign, once he was elected, the Biden administration was not all that interested in just re-entering the JCPOA, even when Iran was, as you say, fully implementing its obligations according to the IAEA. But if you played out that scenario, if the United States re-entered the deal this year, 2023, the JCPOA would require the United States, the Biden administration, a year before President Biden is going to face re-election, it would have required the United States, the Biden administration, to go to Congress and ask Congress to pass law that would change U.S. law and terminate the basis for the anti-nuclear sanctions against Iran that were being lifted temporarily while the JCPOA was implemented. As part of the JCPOA, the Biden administration would have to have gone to Congress this year and asked it to remove the legal bases for those sanctions. And I think enthusiasm for doing that within the Biden administration was, even back in 2021, was pretty limited.
Although presumably that would have been based on 5 years of trust building between the U.S. and Iran.
That was exactly the idea.
And so if there was to be a return, that moment would have to be pushed another 5 years or so into the future.
Perhaps, but this is, in a way, this is my critique of the less militaristic point of view on Iran in the United States, that, well, the JCPOA was working great. Trump messed things up by pulling the United States out of it. Look, don't get me wrong. I supported the JCPOA. It was, to me, a no-brainer. There is no serious non-proliferation case not to support the JCPOA. But in broader strategic terms, the JCPOA on its own was not going to mean all that much. The JCPOA was important potentially if you used it as a springboard for a broader realignment of U.S. relations with Iran. The Obama administration could potentially have done that, but there was, and I think President Obama was himself inclined in that direction, but there was no consensus in the Obama administration to do that, and President Obama wasn't inclined to spend that kind of political capital during his last couple of years in office. And so that opportunity, I think, went by the wayside.
Earlier in 2023, there was a deal between the U.S. and Iran that included a swap of detainees and the release of $6 billion worth of frozen Iranian assets by the United States. And two questions about this. One is, the same divisive political debate applies to this. There are those who say that agreement, and critics of the Biden administration, of the Obama administration, say that agreement empowered Iran and empowered Iranian aggression. On the other hand, one could argue that this suggests that the U.S. remains invested in trying to negotiate a reduction of tensions with Iran, and the Iranians in turn are willing to participate in that, and that perhaps the relationship has not deteriorated as much as is portrayed publicly.
I think that all the things you say are right. I'd also put in, unfortunately, it also showcases another dynamic in U.S.-Iranian relations, which is, just as you say, the United States needs Iran's help with something. It reaches out, terms for some kind of agreement or arrangement get negotiated. Iran does what it's supposed to do. It releases the American citizens that were being held, that the administration had negotiated for. Iran released those folks. The Iranian funds are transferred from South Korea to accounts in Doha, in Qatar. And then, after October 7th, the Biden administration refreezes the funds. Iran kept its part of that prisoner swap, that prisoner exchange. It's the Biden administration, after Iran had done what it's supposed to do, released the people it was supposed to release, then the United States backs off what it is supposed to do as part of the deal. And it's like with the JCPOA. The IAEA says repeatedly, report after report, Iran is complying with its obligations under the deal. The United States ends up backing out of the deal and reimposing sanctions that it had lifted, and then some, pursuant to the JCPOA.
But presumably, much of this is a response to the constant drumbeat of political criticism
Sure.
of the U.S. posture toward Iran. And
That's the real problem with the JCPOA, U.S. domestic politics. And if you only use this for a narrow purpose of managing Iran's nuclear activities for some period of time, it's inevitably going to run into political headwinds. If you used it, as I said, as a kind of springboard, when you've gotten the deal, you're implementing it, and now's the time to start a serious dialogue with Iran about other important issues, because Iran is too important a country in its regional setting for the United States not to have workable relations with it. That's bad for U.S. interests. Inevitably, American administrations end up needing to be able to deal with Iran to protect or advance American interests that matter. And, but our domestic politics don't really let us act on that.
But isn't it possible that Iranian domestic politics are similarly constrained, or is that not necessarily the case?
Sure, there are domestic political dynamics in Iran, and they certainly can be in play around how Iran should deal with the United States. But I would say historically, you see time and time again, when the United States reaches out to Iran for its cooperation on something that matters to the United States, Iran, usually the reaction is, okay, if we can figure out, we in Iran need something out of this too. But if we can work that out, an agreement can be made. And Iran typically does what it does what it has agreed to do, and it usually agrees with most, maybe not all, but most of what the United States has asked of it. And then and the Iranian leadership is able to manage the domestic politics and make that deal and carry through with implementing the parts of it that Iran is responsible for. And then domestic politics in the United States kick in, and the United States then ends up, after Iran has done some substantial part of what it's supposed to do, then the United States reneges. And it's a very corrosive dynamic over time.
So the most recent episode in this ongoing cycle of divisive domestic politics in the United States has to do with recent attacks by various Iranian proxies on U.S. military assets in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. And again, the same debate is taking place in the United States. There are those who are criticizing the Biden administration and saying it is being far too restrained. Clearly, the Biden administration's policy seems to be gauged toward ensuring that the conflict is not spread further. But there are critics who say the response needs to have deterrent force. It needs to be much more forceful. So I guess the question here is, number one, is the Biden administration being restrained in its response? And secondly, is that the right thing to do at this point in time, or should the response be more forceful?
I think you're right that the Biden administration does not want to see this war, the Gaza war, expand beyond its current geographic context. I think that's pretty clear. What I'd also say is Iran doesn't want this war to expand beyond its current context. Ayatollah Khamenei apparently communicated this directly to the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh. Publicly, Khamenei, the Iranian foreign minister, other senior voices in Iran have said, it's great what Hamas did. We didn't have any direct role in it. And they've also made clear that they don't want this war to expand. If Israel starts attacking not just targets over the border in Lebanon, Hezbollah targets, but if, say, Israel launched a ground incursion into Lebanon, that would be a different matter. If Israel and or the United States started attacking targets inside Iran, that's a different matter. Then it's the United States or Israel that's escalated. But if the United States or Israel don't cross those red lines for Iran, my read is that Iran is not going to become directly involved engaging Israeli forces, and Iran is not going to be directly engaging U.S. forces except in regional theaters like Iraq, like Syria, where the U.S. has special forces. Iran doesn't think those forces should be there, but it's nothing new for those forces to trade fire, just like it's nothing new for Hezbollah and Israeli forces to trade, rocket fire, artillery fire across the Israeli-Lebanese border. And I think Iran is prepared to be helpful in some ways as the Biden administration tries to keep this conflict from expanding. Bill Burns, the CIA director, has been spending a lot of time in Doha over the last few weeks, helping arrange the ceasefires, the pauses, the prisoner for hostage exchanges that we've seen between Hamas and Israel. And I think if you look, you'll also see that the Iranian foreign minister, Dr. Abdullahian, has also been spending a good deal of time in Doha during the same period. I'm not privy to those conversations, but I think you're seeing a kind of at least indirect negotiation between the United States and Iran over how to manage this conflict in Gaza and presumably keep it from spreading. The Biden administration has been, to my mind, a little bit schizophrenic in its reaction to this. On the one hand, you have the deployment of not one, but two carrier battle groups to the Mediterranean, which is a pretty striking show of force on the part of the United States. But at the same time, you have the administration signaling, showing in various ways that it really doesn't want this conflict to escalate beyond what it already is.
And presumably, in addition to the United States and Iran, Israel has no interest in a broader regional conflict either.
That depends on which Israelis you talk to. I think there are people in the current cabinet, there are at least some in the IDF upper echelons of leadership that think this war is going to have to expand to take in at least Hezbollah if not Iran itself. Now, that's not a uniformly shared view in Israel, but there are certainly people within the current Israeli government who want to see this war expand. And in many ways, it's perverse, to say the least. But, for the U.S. CIA director and the Iranian foreign minister to be spending lots of time in Doha to interact with the Qataris, who have become the principal mediator for between Israel and Hamas, I think that says something about, I think the Biden administration has to be at least as concerned about risks that Israel will be the actor that escalates this conflict as it is about Iran.
And that leads to my final question, and that is there a path to greater, not only ultimately a resolution to this particular conflict, which at this point is very hard to envisage, but is there a path to greater stability in the Middle East through a U.S. diplomatic approach to Iran, and what might this look like? I mean, given all the constraints that we have talked about in domestic politics and the regional politics as well.
Wow. My wife and I have spent much of our career since we left government service promoting the idea that for its own interest, the United States needs to realign its relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran as thoroughly as the United States realigned its relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s. That argument, obviously, we have not won that argument. And if anything, and I'm very disappointed in this, but if anything, the idea of holding up the opening to China in the 1970s as a positive U.S. diplomatic achievement, that has become so controversial that even in our last Republican administration here in the United States, the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, goes to, of all places, the Nixon Library in California to give a speech in which he says the opening to China was a strategic mistake by the United States. So I don't particularly hold my breath and look for a U.S. initiative of that sort to try and lay the foundations for a better relationship with Iran. One thing that I think could still be possible and is worth thinking about and exploring is a different kind of approach to regional security. It's very interesting. I've spent a lot of time in recent years talking to Chinese scholars and analysts on the Middle East. And part of their critique of the U.S. position in the region, and it's part that I basically agree with, is the Chinese view is the United States can only provide exclusive security in the Middle East. The United States does security partnerships with countries that are going to do what we want them to do and partner with us on our terms. And for states that don't meet those criteria, then it's ostracism, exclusion. The Chinese say what you need is inclusive security. It's like the difference between NATO and the OSCE in the European context. But what the Middle East needs is inclusive security. You need a security mechanism designed precisely to bring states together who don't get along on important things, but put those disagreements into a framework where they might begin to be managed through multilateral diplomacy. And I think that kind of approach is actually really needed in the Middle East now. The regional states, Iran for its part, but even regional states that have long-standing security partnerships with the United States, like the United Arab Emirates, like Qatar, like now Saudi Arabia, they're increasingly focused on regional de-escalation. The big challenge is economic diversification, laying the groundwork for an economic future in the Middle East. That requires a stable region. And so more and more states that have security partnerships with the United States are saying, you know, we have our relationship with the United States, but we can't afford a war with Iran. We're going to act on our own to improve relationships with Iran. And now you have the Chinese coming in and reinforcing that regional trend toward de-escalation, reinforcing it with calls for a new inclusive approach to regional security. And in March, we saw the first real fruits of that when Saudi Arabia and Iran announced this kind of still ongoing rapprochement. That's an argument the United States needs to be making in the region, or else it's going to become less and less relevant on more and more issues. And for sure, our Chinese friends are going to be making that argument if we're not making it and building up their own influence in the region in that way. Maybe we can't do a Nixon to China realignment with Iran right now, but I would hope maybe we could think about a different framework for regional security in the Middle East.
Well, thank you, Professor Leverett, for an enlightening discussion.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
I had a good time. Thanks.